Good morning or good afternoon. Hey guys, and welcome back from spring break. I hope you guys had an absolutely awesome time and are ready to dive back into the learning. This week we're going to go ahead and finish up evolution with neutral evolution. And then we're going to go ahead and move into our next unit next week, which is going to be talking about the different kingdoms we discussed briefly when we talked about classification taxonomy and the different traits that separate them and just the amazing diversity of life created by evolution. So let's go ahead and get started. What is neutral evolution? So thus far we've learned about natural selection. In the 1800s, we know that Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace got together and they wrote a paper and submitted it to I think it was the Royal Society for Science, and they said, "Hey guys, it looks like we've come up with a mechanism to explain how organisms change and adapt over time and speciate, and that's called natural selection." And of course, Darwin then later released his book on it, on the origin of species. And it made a huge ripple, right? And everyone was like, oh my gosh, this seems to explain it all. This is how organisms came to be so diverse, and yet we're all descended from a common ancestor. And so, this was really exciting for scientists because it finally gave them some sort of strategy or some sort of scaffold on which to base everything that they thought about natural selection and evolution. So it seemed like the sort of catch-all answer to everything they wanted to know. So natural selection deemed this phrase to be at the center of everything, descent from a common ancestor with modification, which basically just means that all organisms, all species on the earth today, from pigeons to whales to whatever else you want to talk about, were all descended from a single common ancestor. And through a very long time and modification or adaptations to that ancestor, it's split into a bunch of different populations, and each population experienced different environments and pressures, and each population evolved to handle those pressures, and over time, a bunch of different species evolved from that single ancestor, and then they diversified, and they evolved, and so on and so forth, and it just kept going. So this was a great idea, but a lot of questions came out of it. People were like, okay, so is the Earth even old enough to support this? Because from what you're saying, if I'm going to think that something evolved into a whale and then, a pigeon or something like that, I'm going to think it took a long time for that to happen. So is the Earth even old enough to be able to support natural selection slow pace? Have there been significant enough changes in the environment for that to happen? So has Earth changed enough to warrant that kind of incredible pressure? Because, I mean, think about it. If a population is going to speciate into something like a whale on one hand, and another population is going to speciate into something like a horse on the other, I mean, you're talking about very different environments. Is there enough environmental pressure from the Earth's environments to warrant huge changes like that through adaptation and natural selection? And then how do we explain the variation within a species with selection? Because selection seems to be reducing variation in population, not adding to it. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So all these questions came up out of natural selection and people wanted answers. So people, of course, because they're good scientists, started searching for answers. So way back even before Darwin, and one of the people that inspired him, James Hutton, had hypothesized that in fact, yeah, the Earth had been produced a long time ago, and that all the natural and geologic processes that it produced it had taken a really long time. He suggested millions of years, but scientists in the 20th century were able to use radioactive dating. That does not mean dating somebody who is radioactive. It just means that you use the radiation coming off of atoms to determine how old they are. And we were able to determine that the Earth was even older than Hutton thought, and that, good Lord, evolution by natural selection definitely had time because it had billions of years to work with. So that was pretty cool. That seemed to suggest the idea that, yeah, in fact, all species and all evolution progressed at a very slow pace. So the gradualism that was applied to the Earth by Hutton was then applied to evolution. And so the idea is that evolution happens slowly and continuously over time through slow adaptation and modification. So if we look over here at this illustration, this is the classic illustration for gradualism. We see this original butterfly here, and it looks like this, and then eventually it splits into two populations. Maybe they move to different sides of the mountain or something. This one moves over here, and this one moves over here. And we see that they start off looking pretty much the same. There's just a little bit of variation, but not much. And then over time, due to whatever pressures they're facing, maybe these guys have like black and white looking trees, and these guys like to wrestle in orange flowers or something. And so it's different camouflage for different areas. They slowly change and morph over time. You can look back here and you can follow it step by step until they get up to this point and over here to this point, and they become two different species, the orange species and the black and white species. So this is the idea of gradualism, and it stuck fast in evolution for a long time. The other question, has there been enough change to the Earth, was answered by Charles Lyell and people after him. So Charles Lyell in the 1800s wrote that, yeah, Earth had in fact changed a lot, and that it was still changing, that volcanoes were still erupting, that earthquakes were still shifting the land, that continents were still drifting, etc. And modern evidence has supported this. So if you've looked into, in earth science, the tectonic plates theory and all that stuff, we see that, yes, the Earth's continents have shifted and are still shifting. We see that volcanoes are still erupting and changing the shape of the Earth and its geological features. So yeah, absolutely. The Earth is still changing and evolving, and this change does seem to have affected organisms. In fact, from the evidence that we have in the fossil record and just from census data that we have today, we can see that plenty of organisms were alive on the Earth that are no longer there because of these huge changes in the Earth. I mean, if you look back, good God, like 90, something like crazy, like 97% of all organisms that have ever existed, all species that have ever existed, have gone extinct. We are living with like the 2% of species that are still left. And this is because of those radical changes on the Earth. And of course, humans are helping to accelerate a current mass extinction. Many organisms are going extinct now because of all the resources that humanity is using and not providing for them. So yeah, absolutely. The question, is Earth changing enough to allow for crazy evolution and selection pressures? Yes, the answer is absolutely. There are a lot of selection pressures right now changing a lot of organisms. Okay, this brings us to the last point. Where does variation come from? Does natural selection provide enough variation for it to be true? Now let's, just really quick, why is variation important? If you remember, variation was actually one of the founding preconditions for natural selection. Variation is the idea that even within a species, there can be a bunch of differences in states. So, and this is easy to see in people, right? People come in all different shapes. They come in all different skin colors. They come in different genders. They come with different eye colors and different hair colors and all sorts of stuff. So even though we're all humans, we're all the same species, Homo sapiens sapiens. We all look very different from each other, and that's natural variation. And though it's difficult to tell sometimes, even if we were to take, like 6 German Shepherds or a giant population of German Shepherds or whatever, and we were to compare them, each dog would be slightly different than the other, and it's just natural variation. So why is variation important? Well, variation is the result of mutations in your genes. It's different alleles, and these different alleles build proteins that make you look slightly different from other people. And this variation is crucial, if you remember, to natural selection, because natural selection is going to choose some of those variations to be fit and successful and to be reproduced and carried onto the population, and some that don't make an individual very fit or successful, well, then natural selection is going to make it so that they die off before they can reproduce, and those genes will disappear from the gene pool. So that's very important to evolution, right? Because you're thinking about it. Good God, I mean, that's variation is the key of it all. And so, does natural selection provide enough evidence for variation, or does it provide for a mechanism for variation? Well, originally we thought the variation came from behavior. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in the 1700s said that animals that behaved a certain way, like giraffes stretching their necks, that would actually account for variation, because if an organism started to behave differently, it would pass that behavior on to its offspring, and that behavior would change those offspring's bodies to better suit the behavior, and thus we would have evolution. Of course, now we know that that's incorrect, that giraffes don't get their long necks from stretching them over time, and behaviors don't actually drive evolution. They don't change your body in that way. Now we know that through Mendel and genetics, that variation and adaptation come from mutations in our genes, and these are called alleles, and they're the fittest of these alleles or mutations are selected in the environment and they're passed on, while those that aren't, they die out of the gene pool. So yeah, natural selection seems to match with that, right? Because we can see certain traits being more successful. They're selected for by natural selection, and boom, they stay in the population. But here's the thing, it's not enough. So everything looks great for natural selection in terms of the first two questions, but the last one in variation, there's something wrong with it. Okay, I want you to think about this. If natural selection only keeps the fittest alleles and it gets rid of everything else, shouldn't populations become less diverse over time? Okay, what do I mean? Here's what I mean. Let's say that a population, let's say that brown eyes are the most successful in an environment. And let's say that gray eyes are the least successful in the environment. Okay, well then, if we start with a population that's pretty varied, there's like an equal number of brown and gray eyes. If brown eyes offer a great enough selective advantage, we would expect to see that over time, the gray-eyed individuals would start to reduce in the population and eventually maybe disappear altogether, leaving only the brown-eyed individuals in the population. Well, that actually got rid of diversity, didn't it? Because we started with two eye colors and we ended up with one. So that can't be right. That means that natural selection is getting rid of diversity. It's not contributing to it. But if it gets rid of diversity, how does that work? Because it needs diversity in order to be able to work and for organisms to have variation. So what's going on? Okay, so Moto Kimura in 1968 came up with an answer that kind of shocked the scientific community. He suggested that a majority of mutations or alleles, here he calls them genetic variants, are actually selectively neutral. In other words, they're not innately harmful or beneficial, they just are. So it's like variation, but it's not better or worse. I mean, just in the same way that, let's say that you were to play Super Smash Brothers or something, I don't know, anything, and you were to choose a different skin for Icarus, right? So you would dark Icarus instead of light Icarus, or blue Mario instead of red Mario. Well, it's not going to really change your play style very much. The character moves are all going to be basically the same, depending on what version you play. But their looks are going to be different. So it's not like there's going to be a selective advantage, like, oh yeah, Dark Icarus is way better than normal Icarus. No, they're both equally the same. All right, just like I don't know, just like if I don't know if Obi-Wan Kenobi or whatever went out to do a lightsaber battle with purple robes versus brown robes, well, I doubt it would really affect his lightsaber battling. I mean, he'd look different, but he would be about the same. That's what Moto Kimura is proposing, that many of these mutations don't actually affect an organism's survival at all, but they do promote a lot of variation within the population. So here's a great graphic to sort of show what he's saying. So normally, when we think about the selectionist model, this is people that use only natural selection to explain evolution. They think that most mutations are harmful, and maybe a third are beneficial, and that a few of them are neutral and do nothing. And so most of them, the harmful mutations, they die out of the population. The beneficial ones increase in the population, and the neutral ones don't really do anything. They just rise and fall by chance alone. The neutral model, however, suggests that most of these are still harmful. I mean, that's still a thing. But that instead of that third being beneficial, a third of them are neutral and very few of them are beneficial. And this means that variation can be supported in a population, and that a population can be very diverse without being affected negatively by that diversity. And so there are several mechanisms of this, what he called neutral evolution. And these mechanisms are the things that support those neutral mutations. So the first one is synonymous or silent mutations. We'll talk about that in a bit, but you should remember that from previously. Genetic drift, which includes the genetic bottleneck, founder's effect, and gene flow, and sexual reproduction. Let's go ahead and talk about those. Okay, so the first thing to remember is that not all mutations actually make any kind of change to the protein sequence at all. So if you remember, a mutation is a change in a gene. A gene is a segment of DNA that codes for a protein. So it's basically like a small change in an instruction manual in your cells. And because you've changed the instruction manual, if you remember, that changes what you eventually build, right? Just like if you change the instruction manual for building a cabinet, the cabinet would look different, right? But there are some silent changes, some small changes, maybe just changing a V to an A or a period to a comma or something like that. And these small changes don't actually affect the end product. But they do provide for variation within your genes. So these are called silent or synonymous mutations. They don't change the amino acid sequence of the gene, but they do change the bases within the original genetic code. So we can see this here. If we look down at the bottom right, we can see that the original DNA was TTC, its mRNA was AAG, and it produced lysine, the amino acid lysine. A silent mutation has changed TTC to TTT. This has changed the codon sequence to AAA, but it still produces lysine. So that's what we know as a silent mutation, and this provides variation within your genes. Variation that isn't selected for or reduced by natural selection, it's just there. We can see that nonsense mutations would cause a stop, which would destroy the amino acid sequence altogether, and a missense would just change the amino acid sequence, which would change the protein. These can be selected for or deleterious, right? But this silent mutation isn't going to be selected for. It will remain neutral, not harmful or beneficial. Genetic drift is the other way that neutral evolution can work, and the idea is that random changes can actually occur to change the allele frequencies in the population. It doesn't always have to be natural selection. So, for example, a natural disaster or random predation, maybe one day a wolf just happens to eat a particular lizard or sheep or whatever because it's hungry. Differences in the litter size. So, just maybe one year a mama bird has like a ton of little baby birds, and one year she has very few. And so that's going to change the number of individuals with certain genes in the population. But just basically random stuff, not pointed. It's not like only the brown-eyed individuals are being targeted or only the gray-eyed individuals are being targeted. Random brown or gray-eyed individuals might die because they're old, because they get hit by a car, because they get eaten by a lion randomly. All sorts of stuff can happen out there. You never know, because they tripped off the sidewalk. All sorts of stuff can happen that can change a population, and it's not just due to natural selection. Okay, population bottleneck is a type of genetic drift. So population bottleneck describes when a natural disaster comes along, and the natural disaster that comes along is going to wipe out most of the population, and the few members of the population that it leaves behind are going to dictate what that population looks like for the future. So this is demonstrated by this gumball model, which shows that we have all these different colors of gumballs, and they're all in equal proportions to each other starting off. After we pay for a couple of gumballs, though, and we get those gumballs out of the slot, these are the only colors we end up with. Now, imagining that these were organisms, and that this is our original population of organisms, and that this represents a natural disaster that leaves only a few organisms behind, the colors of the organisms that remain are going to dictate the colors that survive in the population. Any colors that were completely lost due to the genetic disaster, well, they're not going to be able to come back. They're gone unless a random mutation can bring them back. So the new population is determined, its appearance is determined by who survived. That's what we call population bottleneck, and it's the first type of genetic drift we're going to talk about. The second type of genetic drift we could talk about is the founder's effect. The founder's effect happens when a certain population in one area has a few of its members that leave and move to a different area. So here we can see that we have an ancestral population on this island, and a couple of them move to this island. Now, on this island, it's just like in a bottleneck, the only individuals that are representing that population are the orange and the black ones. So there aren't going to be any white individuals over here, just orange and black, right? Unless white individuals move from the ancestral population over to the island. So the founder's effect can happen multiple times, and we can have maybe these guys over here find another island up here, and only the black ones move up there. And so it's only orange on this island, only black over here, and there's a mix over here. Or whatever. So founder's effect can happen in any kind of combination. And again, it's just choosing a few individuals that move away, establish their own population, and the allele frequencies of the population change based on that. Again, this is not dictated by natural selection. And yet it's a change in alleles. Gene flow is the final version of genetic drift, and gene flow we've actually already talked about when we talked about speciation. Gene flow is when an individual from one population goes and interbreeds, mates with another population, and it therefore carries its alleles or the genes from this population over here and mixes them with this one. So gene flow is like mixing. It's adding diversity to the gene pool. And sometimes this can happen. Sometimes an individual can randomly move from one population to the next and interbreed, and that random movement changes the allele frequencies. It's not dictated by natural selection, it's neutral evolution. It doesn't provide an evolutionary benefit or selective benefit, but it does change those allele frequencies. So immigration, which is coming into a population, or excuse me, leaving a population, or immigration, which is coming into a population, randomly can affect that population's genes and therefore its evolution. Sexual reproduction is not a form of genetic drift. Those are the only three forms of genetic drift we'll talk about, the bottleneck, founder's effect, and gene flow. But sexual reproduction is another way in which neutral evolution occurs, and we've already talked about it. It should be familiar to you. It happens during meiosis, which is sexual reproduction, which is what creates your gametes, or your sex cells. So crossing over the law of independent assortment and the law of segregation, which we learned about in Mendel, those are all going to shuffle your alleles around when you're making your sex cells and your kids. And it's going to make it so that each kid receives a unique combination of chromosomes and genes, and genes and alleles, making it so that everybody looks different from each other and from their parents. Of course, we learned there are exceptions to that, such as cloning and twinning, but for the most part, this holds in nature, right? So we have everybody looking unique, and that causes a lot of variation. So neutral evolution completely changed the way that people thought about evolution. It was added to natural selection as being one of the main mechanisms of evolution. So it's not just natural selection, the environment actively selecting for changes in the population and reducing diversity. It's also the increase of diversity by random events that alter the population's allele frequencies separate from natural selection. This is really, really cool to think about, and it provided a lot of scientists with a good jolt to make them go, I wonder what other assumptions we made about evolution might be wrong. One of those big assumptions that they found to be incorrect was that of gradualism. So I told you that gradualism sort of migrated over from talking about just the Earth to talking about the evolution of organisms. So gradualism actually turns out to be not very accurate. It is true that organisms slowly change over time, but there are times in the fossil record where we can see that this explosion of forms and variation came out of very little variation from before, and it happened in a very short period of time. So how does that happen? So what that suggests is that when a species encounters a huge environmental change or disaster. Okay, so maybe it's the meteor that comes down and destroys the dinosaurs, or maybe it's a huge earthquake that causes a mountain to rise up suddenly, or maybe it's a sinkhole that creates a giant lake or river. Whatever the case may be, a giant change that comes along like that can spark a rapid transformation in organisms, a transformation that's far more rapid than the gradualism theory would have predicted, and it happens in a much faster period of time. It happens because natural selection and neutral evolution work together to provide not only the variation, but the sudden environmental influences that'll change a population. So we can see here that we start with the same butterfly we started at before in the gradualism model, but this time we have some sort of rapid change occur that makes it so that it splits into several different species, right? We have maybe it's the allopatric speciation. They're separated by mountains or rivers or whatever. And they adaptively radiate. In other words, they adapt to their new environments quickly and they change quickly. And what's more significant is that this means that the original species, which may have continued to survive, could live at the same time as its descendants. We see that this is the case all the time, that many organisms that descended from another one evolutionarily are still alive. We can see that today, right? And we can still see that there are ancient archaeans and bacteria from which eukaryotes like us evolved, and they're still alive, they're still kicking around the earth. But we can see that we deviated from them at some point. So punctuated equilibrium just means that organisms will rapidly evolve during a period of great turmoil or some sort of great environmental shift. and that they'll evolve and speciate rapidly and promote that diversity of life, and then go back to gradually developing. So we can see that after they diversify, after they split off and they become something new, we can see that they remain relatively unchanged or only slightly changed over time at the end. So gradualism and punctual equilibrium sort of work together to explain evolution. So I hope you've enjoyed this wrap up to evolution. It's amazing to think about. There's so much more we're going to go into with the lab day and everything, but I hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to this home stretch. Guys, we are almost at the end, and it's been a crazy but great year. So I look forward to providing that content for you and hearing back from you guys at the Zoom meetings and also in your responses to your assignments. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and stay well.